Hello, folks. I'm on the home stretch now. We've been talking about D-Day all day. This is show number 7. There's just 3 more to go. And my guest now is best-selling author Garrett M. Graff, who, after tackling Watergate and 9/11 and various other subjects, has turned his, I suppose, detective skills to D-Day and his new oral history, which is available in the links below. I've got an American edition in my hand here. It has a slightly different title in the UK, but it's available to purchase now. It's getting rave reviews, and I'm honored to kind of call Garrett a friend now, and we're going to talk about his approach to this, and I'll bring him in. So 9 in the morning there. So first media gig of the day, I expect, for you.
It's actually my second. We
Second.
started early here as well, but not as early as you did.
No, but it's a busy day for everybody. So as I said at the top of the show there, you know, you've got a particular focus of looking at telling these pivotal moments in history through the voices of those who were there. And, you know, you've tackled, you know, as I said, Watergate and 9/11, when for 9/11 particularly, a lot of the people who were talking about it were with us. But turning your attention to D-Day, which when you began was, 78 years in the past, it's now 80 years in the past, a very different prospect. So before we get into, you know, what you learned on this process and some of your favorite stories and things you learned, did you approach the research in the same way as the previous books, or did you kind of turn it around and try a different approach?
Yeah. As you said, this book in some ways is a prequel or a sequel, however you would want to define it, to a similar book that I did in 2019 that was called The Only Plane in the Sky, which was an oral history of 9/11.
Yeah.
And that book came out on the 18th anniversary of 9/11 here in the United States. And that was sort of this really interesting moment as a historian, as you began to see 9/11 slip from living memory into history. So,
Right.
18 years after 9/11 in 2019, you had the first American servicemen and women going through basic training and deploying to Iraq and Afghanistan to fight in wars that began before they were born. You know, you had the first recruits going into the fire department of New York, who were born after the day when FDNY lost 343 of its brave firefighters and emergency personnel. And there was just beginning to be in America this generation who didn't know 9/11. And my hope with that oral history had been to try to tell a story that captured a little bit more of the fear and trauma and chaos and confusion of what it was like for those of us who did live through 9/11. Because you see, you know, when you read the 4 lines about 9/11 in a history book, it's, you know, the attack began at 8:46 in the morning and ended at 10:28. And the whole thing was over in 102 minutes, and there were 4 planes, and it was New York and Pennsylvania and the Pentagon, and 3,000 people were killed. And that's not the day that any of us who were alive on 9/11 remember living, because, you know, we didn't know when the attacks began, we didn't know when the attacks were over. And I wanted to sort of capture, for a generation who was going to grow up in a world shaped by 9/11, what it was like to experience that day. Now, D-Day in some ways comes at the opposite end of that historical arc. You know, this 80th anniversary that we're marking this week and this month and this year is in many ways also the final passing of what, you know, we in the US call the greatest generation, you know, the generation who fought and won World War II. And, you know, there were 1 million personnel on the move for the Allies across D-Day, June 6, 1944. That number has dwindled to just a few thousand. I think England estimates that there are just 6 living D-Day veterans left. You know, there are 60 some odd Americans who have journeyed back to Normandy this week. You know, a Canadian D-Day veteran actually died just a few days ago, you know, who had been planning to go back this week. And there's a news story already out this morning about one of those returning veterans who died in France during the ceremonies this week. And so my goal in doing this book as an oral history was, we have effectively right now every living memory, every living testimonial, every first person account of D-Day that we will ever have in history. And, you know, this is not something where, you know, we're going to be manufacturing new D-Day oral histories a decade from now. And so my hope with this book was to capture the opposite end of that historical arc and to try to tell the story of D-Day in the voices of the people who experienced it, now for a nation and a country and a society and a world that no longer remembers D-Day at all. And sort of this is the moment when D-Day will fully pass from living memory into permanent history, and trying to tell that story in the first person, in the voices of the people who lived it, I thought was a really important way to try to carry the legacy of that generation forward.
Absolutely. And my next question, and then we'll get to the D-Day itself, is, were people speaking the same in the 1940s about life as the people in, you know, the early 20th century about life? I mean, are there core similarities, or was there a generational difference when you start looking at these sources? Is the expressiveness of people, for example?
Yeah, I think both are true, and sort of true in interesting and nuanced ways. That so to assemble this book, I gathered over the last 2 years something on the order of about 5,000 oral histories, letters, contemporaneous letters, official reports, memoirs, video archives, you know, radio, TV transcripts, and the book in the end has just shy of 700 of those voices, all woven together to tell the story of D-Day, and not just, of course, June 6, 1944, but the planning and the logistics and the exercises and the training that lead up to it, including at least one voice who is very special to you, which we can get to, Uncle Cyril.
Yeah, good, Uncle Cyril. Yeah.
And what was interesting to me was, you know, when you're dealing with the 9/11 oral histories, for instance, you know, there was such an immediate rush by professional historians and professional oral historians, particularly, to capture those voices right after 9/11. You know, the Pentagon has historians working on the, you know, oral histories of the Pentagon survivors by October 2001. And when you are dealing with the World War II oral histories, you don't generally have that contemporaneous record, because it was a generation that, I mean, the war kept going for a while, obviously, and so, you know, there wasn't a huge rush for these veterans in the Hurtgen forest to sit down and, you know, record on vinyl records their memories of D-Day from a couple of months earlier. But you really see sort of the waves of historical interest in D-Day captured in these oral histories. You know, the sort of first big wave of them actually come around Cornelius Ryan's publication of The Longest Day. And then you see George Kazkamaki's book, D-Day with the Screaming Eagles, gather sort of a whole new set for the 30th anniversary. And then it's really into the 40th and 50th anniversaries where you begin to have President Reagan sort of lionize this generation anew, that you see the bulk of these oral histories actually captured for the first time. And So in many ways, these are oral histories of much older men looking back on this pivotal day when they were, 19, 20, 21 years old. And at the same time, what feels the same is, I think that there's a unique power that comes from oral history in the way that it puts you back in the footsteps of the people as they experience events, only knowing what they knew at the
Yeah.
time. That I
Yeah.
think one of the challenges of narrative history, and as you know, I've written plenty of narrative history myself and love it and love to read it and love to write it. But try as hard as you might, there's a sense of when you're writing narrative history to make things seem more linear, more interconnected, more neater, cleaner, simpler, and even more predetermined than they were for the participants at the time. And sort of the example that I would give is, we look back on D-Day as this giant historic triumph of bravery and courage. Well, you read the letters that these soldiers are writing aboard the ships on June 5th, as they cross the channel, or the paratroopers as they are aboard the planes flying across the channel on the night of June 5th. There's not a lot of sense of courage and bravery and heroism among them. What they're scared, they're lonely, they're wondering if they've trained hard enough. They're wondering if they have what it takes to get through the next, the next day, whether they're going to let down their comrades and their colleagues and their friends, in the moments when it matters the most. I have these really powerful quotes in the sort of oral history chapter of crossing the channel that night of, these men saying, Eisenhower is sitting there calling us, these great crusaders, and we're not really feeling like crusaders right now.
That's a really good point, because I was going to bring up the fact that you have written your book after the firm establishing of the greatest generation concept that sort of Tom Brokaw pretty much kicked off that, and this idolization and pillarization and putting on a pedestal of that generation, which is well deserved. And I'm sure all of the speeches that are occurring at the ceremonies today will be talking about that we as the next generations owe so much to that generation. And I'm not saying that's not absolutely the right sentiment to have, but I think it's important to be reminded that that's not how they saw themselves, certainly at the time.
Yeah.
And maybe not today either. And it would be very easy just to include the stories of the ones who felt invincible going in and felt they were going to survive, and just were kind of thinking about how many Jerrys they were going to bag and how far they'd get to Berlin that night. But the reality is that's not what most of them were feeling. There was, as you were conveying there's this sense of, will I make it? Will it even work? Will I even get there? Will I perform? And so, the difference, I guess, between 9/11 and Operation Overlord is that Overlord has this long precursor to it. This sense of the planning being going back 2 years. And we had this conversation repeatedly when we were here in Normandy about, because I kind of nudged you to maybe consider widening the remit a little bit, because we were just talking about, when does D-Day start and when does D-Day end? Because you could literally just kind of just say 12 p.m. end of June the 6th, bam, slam that book shut. But you're kind of leaving stories untold. So, do you want to kind of explain about how you wrestled with that? Well, firstly, the kind of the concept of the greatest generation, and then perhaps the kind of the time frame. What does D-Day mean?
And they're very interlinked, of course, because one of the things that probably, every book that you write as an author sort of surprises you in the way that it changes during the writing. And for me, the thing that most surprised me was how much of this book ends up being about what happens in the weeks, months, and years leading up to D-Day itself. That you think you when you say I'm going to write about D-Day, you think, okay, like maybe I'll start at noon on June 5th and then, sort of take people through, the day and wrap up at midnight. But of course, the success of D-Day is laid, weeks and months and years in advance by the work of the Allies, the planning, the logistics, the supplies. There's the sort of famous saying that I'm going to slightly butcher here, but and your viewers will know of, amateurs talk tactics,
Professionals talk logistics.
Professionals talk logistics, and part of what I think was so interesting, again, about the mythology of D-Day versus what the reality of D-Day ends up being is, the story that we tell about D-Day, the story that, King Charles and Emmanuel Macron and Joe Biden are all, lionizing today is, about this incredible allied relationship. Britain and America have this special relationship. We are the greatest of partners. We're the greatest of allies. That's takes a couple of years to get to that point.
It has high moments and it has some low moments. And so when you talk about this channel, Torch was probably the big testing point of the American and British relationship, and the Canadians have their issues, and the Poles, and we could go into the whole that dynamic as well, and all the other countries. But yeah, it's as we said, today is the right time. We talked about the elections that are happening in the Netherlands today, France 3 days time, America, US this year, UK this year. Togetherness, working together, they're the messages I want to be sent out there, but reminding ourselves that these relationships had to be worked at. They a marriage, they had to put the effort in.
And even at the highest levels, I mean, the work that Winston Churchill and Roosevelt do, at a very high level, for years before America really enters the war.
Yeah.
It is a pretty tense relationship because, Roosevelt is fighting the isolationism of domestic politics. America is, pretty strongly disinclined to get involved in that little war you Europeans are having if we can avoid it. And to me, one of the really actually poignant chapters of this book ends up being the chapter on Pearl Harbor, where you have, Roosevelt talking about how he slept so well the night of June 6th because he knew really sort of for the first time that England was going to be safe. He says, no American will think it wrong of me if I proclaim that to have the United States at our side was to me the greatest joy. I could not foretell the course of events. I do not pretend to have measured accurately the martial might of Japan. But now, at this very moment, I knew the United States was in the war, up to the neck and into the death. England would live, Britain would live, the Commonwealth of Nations and the Empire would live. Hitler's fate was sealed, Mussolini's fate was sealed, and as for the Japanese, they would be ground to powder. I went to bed and slept the sleep of the saved and the thankful. And then what you see is this, massive, angry, awakened America beginning to, gear up for a war that astounds the British planners. They in these sort of first meetings about the Second Front, the Americans are, like, we'll deliver, X number of troops and Y number of tanks and, Z number of planes. And the Brits are sitting there saying, you're talking about, like, in single months delivering forces that are the size of our entire army at this moment. And then, the Americans actually do it. And we move 1.4 million personnel across the ocean. I mean, moving literal armies across the ocean. And I call that chapter in the book, as you know, the American invasion, because long before the Allies invade Europe, you have the Americans invade England, and that comes with all of its own uncomfortable culture shocks for the military and the politicians and the society, including, to me, one of the most interesting sort of subplots of the book turn out to be the racial tensions of the Black American troops coming in a segregated military from Jim Crow era politics back here in the United States over to England, where there is sort of no segregation and no racial discrimination. And you have these white Southern officers horrified by the idea that, all of the pretty young British ladies will dance with a Black soldier as happily as they'll dance with a white soldier. And what that ends up doing to the American military, and how the military tries to enforce racial segregation on England. There's a lot more to this special relationship than just the glory of these armies marching together across Europe.
Absolutely, and we don't shy away from that on this channel. And John McManus particularly is always bringing in that theme of race inequality that is throughout World War II, not just on the baddies side, but unfortunately on the goodies side. So that's maybe a heavier subject for today. But I angled at the beginning about the fact that this is in some ways not in some ways, it is your first World War II project, and may who knows, might be your last delve into World War II. But I feel just to lighten McDermott, as a regular presenter, Garrett will never make it as a historian. Yes, he's rigorous and all that, but he speaks too clearly. He's too handsome in the clinchery as he has too much hair. So you can't quite be one of us sad middle-aged military historians. But on a serious note, we talked about him. Dr. Phil Blood is watching today, and Phil Blood has been studying D-Day since the 1980s, 70s, and the military history is his profession, it's his life. But you've come to this, say, not the history world, but the military history and World War II world. Do you sort of think now, looking back with the book out there, that was an advantage going in without some preconceived ideas, or was it a disadvantage, and perhaps you wished you'd had that 30 years of reading about model Sherman tanks? What's your reaction?
Yeah, and you didn't ask this question, I know, for me to plug what a wonderful human being you are, but that's what the answer is going to include here. What I will say was really wonderful for me stepping into this story was there are a lot of communities of historians scattered across the various interests and genres and subject matters, who are pretty prickly and territorial, and protective of their sources and their archives and their records. And I will say I was really overwhelmed by how warmly welcomed I was by the community of D-Day historians.
Yeah, we're a good bunch, really. Yeah.
And, I, as I said, I collected, thousands of oral histories for this book, but it was all archival. It was all, things recorded decades ago. And so there were a number of times that I was turning to historians who didn't know me from Adam and saying, hey, like, I saw in your book, you quoted so-and-so, or you have, this set of records or something like that. Can you share it with me? And, Ted Barris, who's a Canadian journalist who wrote what I think is probably, and I think probably the definitive book on Juno, in terms of, actually going out and interviewing decades ago a lot of the Canadian veterans, for what you might feel differently, but what to me always feels like sort of the most neglected of the beaches from a historical standpoint.
I think it isn't now because of the work of Ted and Mark.
Yes,
Zeltsky
exactly.
I think maybe, and in the ever changing league table of which how beaches, Omaha's always going to be the most talked about. That's there now. But I think maybe gold has dropped to number 5 now. Stephen Fisher's new book on sword has maybe pushed that up. Well, I would say Juno might be 2nd or 3rd now. Utah or Juno, and that's the work of people like Ted.
Yep. But I emailed Ted and called Ted and explained what I was looking for, and I was like, can you get me the transcripts of these interviews you did with these veterans decades ago for your book? And literally the next day he had gone out to his garage, he'd opened the boxes, he'd taken the transcripts down to his local Staples and had them scanned and emailed to me. And those are records now that are like literally irreplaceable. There is nowhere that you can go to get those types of memories anymore for any amount of money. And for him to share those so generously was tremendous. And then I got to come over and I spent a week with you, as you know, but your viewers don't, touring through
everywhere, basically
everywhere, and it was its own forced march of 5 days of touring. But I learned so much from you, and I talk about in the book the way that my time with you on the battlefield really transformed my understanding of D-Day. Because
that's very kind of you. I'm feeling I'm going to go red now, but thank you.
Yeah.
And I was very gratified to read what you said about me. Thank you.
But I think when you read D-Day history, you get caught up in the sort of the grand story of D-Day, and you get caught up in the strategy and the Ikes and the Monties and the Roosevelts and the Churchills, and what the time that I spent with you on the ground made me think about was there is no one D-Day story. There are 167,000 individual stories of D-Day, some of which overlap with others, but many of which are, the entire story takes place in, one foxhole or one hedgerow or one, one corner of one beach somewhere, where the participants had no sense of the larger invasion. The number of sort of paratroopers who talk about in their oral history, paratroopers and commandos, and sort of have lines about like, we spent that whole day, we didn't even know whether the invasion had ever taken place. We didn't know whether, we're out there fighting in the hedgerows. We haven't seen any sign of the landings. We don't know whether the landings have been called off. We didn't know whether help was coming at all. And to sort of be there on those beaches, in those hedgerows with you, and to say, this is the view that Jimmy Monteith had. And, that's where the German machine gun was. And that's where the other German machine gun was. And he had to go here and then there. And then, this is where he made his final stand, or, this is where Stanley Hollis did this, or, this is where, standing with you at Lafayette Causeway was just this, almost religious experience for me, in the sense of, that's a bridge that when you're standing there, you could walk past or drive past today without even ever noticing that you had been over a bridge. And it is so small, and yet, it was fought over so heavily that day. And of course for the 4 days after, and that's the bridge that historian SLA Marshall says was not just the fiercest fight of the European theater, but was the fiercest small unit engagement of American arms. That it's a 4-day fight that sees 2 medals of honor and 18 distinguished service crosses. I mean, just like think of the bravery over that sort of one tiny stone bridge that ends up with 20 medals of honor and distinguished service crosses.
Yeah, no, extraordinary. I was there on the 3rd. I'll be there again the 9th. So, you know, we'll talk now about what effect some of these stories had on you, because, you know, there's 5,000 stories that you, archives and histories you went through, and then you've got to piece them together and tell that story, then add your contextual structure to it there. But, you know, moving forward, and you'll do other work, and you'll do other books, and you'll do other things, but there must now be these stories of individuals that will just forever be indelibly marked in your brains. And I have that when I take people on tours, that they will all come away, I would hope, with some kind of understanding of how the day unfolded. But there'll be that particular story that one person will take away with, and one, it will be a different story, because we're all different human beings. But in a sense, forgetting the book, but for you as a human being, are there, you know, 2 or 3 of the accounts you read and you included that will stay with you?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I actually had the experience just a few hours ago last night to sort of live one of them, which is, you know, this is in this book on D-Day. You know, it's packed with pictures of the beaches and the units and the fighting, but I only included 2 individual photos of soldiers from D-Day. One, of course, is Stanley Hollis, the one British soldier who receives the Victoria Cross for actions on D-Day. And then the other is Staff Sergeant Waverly Woodson Jr., who is a Black medic with the only Black combat unit that lands on D-Day for the American Army. There were about 2,000 Black soldiers who landed on D-Day. Only one, most of them were stevedores and quartermasters, and there was only one combat unit that landed. And Waverly Woodson was their medic. And he comes ashore on Omaha Beach about 10 a.m. And he is wounded even before he gets to shore. His LCT hits a mine. He's wounded in the back and groin by shrapnel, makes it to shore, and he sets up what is perhaps the first aid tent and casualty station on Omaha Beach that morning. He ends up spending 30 hours on Omaha Beach treating U.S. casualties, treating the wounded before being evacuated himself. And he treats, later estimated, somewhere around 200 American casualties that he helps to treat. So, you know, that's about 5 to 7% of all U.S. casualties on Omaha Beach. You know, a statistically significant portion of all the injured that he is involved in treating personally. Well, his commander, you know, several ranks above him, General Lee, the head of the Supply Corps, recommends that he be considered for the Medal of Honor. There's a memo that goes around the White House that fall that says Franklin Roosevelt should consider awarding Waverly Woodson the Medal of Honor personally because of how much it would mean to the Black troops.
Yeah.
In the racism of World War II, though, in the segregated military, not a single Black soldier is awarded any of the 432 medals of honor that the U.S. gives out in World War II. The Clinton administration in the 1990s, after the 50th and around the 50th, convenes a commission to sort of study and reevaluate the Valor Awards given to Black soldiers in World War II. They find that there were 4 Black soldiers considered contemporaneously for a Medal of Honor nomination, and end up giving medals of honor to 3 of them, but not Waverly Woodson, not the 4th, because by then the Pentagon has lost his paperwork. And he dies in 2005, never having received a Combat Valor Award for his actions on Omaha Beach. And his family has continued the fight. It's been picked up by some members of Congress. the First Army, which was his parent unit. Their historian has spent the last decade working on trying to pry some of these records out of the bowels of archives and Pentagon record keeping. There was a historian named Linda Herview who helped sort of popularize Waverly Woodson's story with her book about Black D-Day soldiers in 2015 called Forgotten. And, you know, I just found myself really taken by his story. And I was incredibly excited to be able to break the news in Politico on Monday here in the US that the Pentagon, that the Army is finally awarding Waverly Woodson the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest combat valor award, for his service on Omaha Beach. And actually today, the First Army has taken a World War II era DSC, and they have geolocated on Omaha Beach where Waverly Woodson came ashore. And they are holding a ceremony there today with that medal to mark Waverly Woodson's heroism on D-Day. And then the medal will come back to the United States and be presented to Waverly Woodson's widow, who turned 95 last Sunday.
Wow. How amazing is that?
And I had the chance last night here in the US to do a TV show on CNN with Waverly Woodson's son, Stephen, who has been a big part of this fight. And to meet him and shake his hand was just a really big moment for me, sort of this week, as we mark so much valor and courage and heroism. You know, Waverly Woodson's story still stands out to me and inspires.
Oh, that's so pleasing to hear. I know Linda a little bit. She lives in Paris, and she was on the very first, the mammoth 17-hour stream I did 4 years ago today, and came on and told that story. And she was talking about her part in this process, and I'm sure she's thrilled as well that it's come to a resolution. Yeah. And it's important, of course, to remind us. Al Murray said it on a spot he did on British television yesterday evening, that World War II and D-Day is almost unique in the sense that it's the only war that came to everybody wherever you were on the globe. Whether it arrived in your doorstep, young, old, male, woman. World War II affected you, and that's important to remind ourselves that moving forward, it is one of those things that everybody went through it and had different experiences through it, but it did bring the world together in a merciless, terribly casualty-ridden conflict. But it did, at the same time, it was a shared experience, and that togetherness is something that is being echoed at the speeches today. So, you know, back to the book and the D-Day histories. I mean, you know, I in the early, so when you were putting the book together, and you'd done a bulk of the kind of research before you came to Normandy. You were kind of mostly kind of through the process to some extent. Then you carried on there. Did it ever kind of feel overwhelming? Did you ever feel you would never get it down in the selection process of who to eliminate? And because at first glance, if you don't know, I'll just do a book on D-Day. Then as you realize, it's a massive kind of complicated operation. Did you kind of reach a moment of, I can't do this, or did it all go rather smoothly?
I've been through enough books at this point that I sort of know there's always that valley in any book writing process. You know, the first draft of this book, when I started editing in sort of late summer last year, was, I think, 1.2, 1.4 million words. So, you know, that's like 4,000 to 5,000 pages, which was longer than my editor was willing to consider publishing. And so, you know, those last 6 months of work were really just squeezing it down. And, you know, I think when I talk about oral history, what I talk about is you're always looking for the ordinary and the extraordinary. You're looking to find sort of the most typical experiences. You know, if you were the average paratrooper, if you were the average, you know, soldier in a landing craft, what was your experience like? And you're looking for those voices who are sort of the most average and the most representative of the experience that day. On 9/11, it's like, who's the person who has the most ordinary experience walking down the stairs, evacuating the North Tower? And then you're looking for the extraordinary. You're looking for the people who have the experiences, several standard deviations outside of the normal, at the limits of human experience or capability or survival. What really stood out going through these oral histories is how on D-Day, as trite as it might seem to say, that the extraordinary was the ordinary. That, you look at what the average experience of a, soldier coming into, Omaha Beach, the average experience of a paratrooper that night. And they are, their experiences that on sort of any other day in World War II would be, some of the greatest stories of heroism or courage or valor that we know, but that on D-Day are sort of just mixed in with all of these others. And then in the incredibly rough way that the, military honors people and government honors people, they're like, all right, well, out of everyone today, we're going to give 4 medals of honor. We're going to pick one guy and he's going to get the Victoria Cross. And, there are so many actions that you see that day that sort of on any other given day in World War II would be a candidate for a DSC, would be a candidate for a Medal of Honor. And then, you sort of get into the tough calculations that the military does. And they're like, well, we've already given a Medal of Honor to someone in the 16th Infantry. So, better luck next invasion.
Yeah. That's that they're doing the same editing process in a way that you're doing. Is that you can't?
Exactly, yes.
If you give everybody a medal, it then invalidates the process of what you're trying to do. So it's complicated. So, we're going to bring things to an end shortly. But the other thing I wanted to ask you as a specialist in oral history is that we're dealing with this ongoing idea of the validity of veterans' testimony and eyewitness accounts, and it's an ongoing thing, and it's complicated, and we have to cross-check, we have to corroborate, we have to make sure that we do our best to make sure things are true. But the interesting thing from oral history is that something can be true from an individual's perspective, but false in a larger perspective. In that, if you've crouched in a foxhole because you think it's a Tiger tank attacking you, and we now know that unit didn't have Tiger tanks, it could only have been a Panzer IV Armada, that doesn't mean that at the person wasn't reacting as if it was a Tiger. So I know it's a big subject to bring up towards the end of this discussion, but as a specialist in this, how do you grapple with that basic concept of validity and truth?
Yep. And I think for me, both with 9/11 and with D-Day, I have the advantage of there are tremendous, incredibly rigorous, factual histories, narrative histories that have already been written. If you want to know the absolute truth of D-Day, read Peter Caddick Adams' Sand and Steel.
Yeah.
That book to me, which you recommended to me.
Sorry for how long it took you to read it. It's an author, isn't it?
And I was like, do I really have to read all 1,000 pages of that? And you're like, yes, you do. And I was like, all right. And then, I sat there with that book next to my computer every day that I wrote this book. Sort of similarly, when I was coming to the 9/11 story, if you want the story of 9/11, we have a government commission in the 9/11 Commission report that spent $32 million establishing the precise tick-tock of that day. What my goal was to, as you sort of, I think, eloquently just put it, capture the individual truths of that day and of that experience, which is a slightly different historical mission than trying to, you know, tell the sort of full scope of the day in all of its nuance and texture. And you know, I tried to do a little bit of fact checking and editing of quotes. You know, in you know, you have so many soldiers that day heading in landing craft who are like, you know, and then I heard the USS Texas 14-inch guns, and they're 15-inch guns, and 16-inch guns, and 20-inch guns, and you're like, well, you know, it was only one set of guns, and they were, you know, not 9-inch guns. But you know, so many of those military details actually are even lost to the soldiers themselves as they are going through the experience. And so, you know, I did a little bit of correcting here and there in the quotations just to sort of correct the accuracy. And you know, there were plenty of accounts that I left out of the book because they don't factually add up. You know, one of the big problems that you do have with oral history, particularly oral history that's been conducted either in sort of stream of consciousness by a veteran or by a family member who's not steeped in this, is, you know, they'll conflate multiple days worth of events into, you know, a single story. And so trying to untangle, you know, okay, well, where was this unit really on D-Day, and, you know, what were they actually engaged on? You know, is a big part of sort of cross-checking some of that background. But to your point, you know, you don't, and you know, you and I sort of talked about the, you know, D-Day cliche almost of, you know, the sea was red with blood, and you're like, you know, no, it wasn't. It was the English Channel, and, you know, humans just don't bleed that much, and, you know, yada yada yada. But, you know, there were certainly veterans who, you know, are coming ashore on D-Day seeing blood in the water, and that is, you know, translated in their mind to, you know, and you know, the English Channel was red. And
we've
again,
had it
like,
this week with the piles of limbs, and you go, well, piles, but that's that again. That's how they've recorded that memory in their brains. That is their truth. It was so horrific. The experience was so wrought, so that they've built a picture of it that, again, it's true to them, but it can't actually be factually true.
Yeah.
But we'll have to bring. Sorry.
And I was going to say, and, you know, you've lived this in sort of other ways. You know, I remember sort of all of your stories when we were together of the way that you've burst family bubbles of people who have had this oral tradition in their family of, you know, my grandpa came ashore on Omaha Beach on D-Day, and you're like, well, actually their unit landed on June 9th or, you know, July 12th. And yes, they did come ashore at Utah or Omaha.
Exactly.
But, you know, not on D-Day itself. And that's just not how the stories get handed down in oral tradition.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to leave it to it because you've got other things to do. Are you going straight to another gig in a minute? I've got another gig to go. Garrett, I hope our paths cross again. I'm sure they will. It's been fantastic talking to you. And folks, the link is in the description below, or buy it at your favorite bookstore. But don't forget, different title in the UK and the US, which is reflected in the links that you'll see below. So happy June the 6th, 80th anniversary, Garrett.
Well, thank you. And I'm so grateful to you, Woody, for all that you have done to keep this D-Day story alive, and I'm grateful for your friendship and help with this book, because as I say, almost every page of this book is different because of your influence and your contributions.
What you're saying is it's my fault.
Exactly. All the mistakes,
all the errors are his and his alone.
Paul and his website. Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay. Thanks very much, Garrett. Have a great day, folks. I will see you in 10 minutes with Mike Nyberg. Cheers, everybody. Bye.